Well, Merry Christmas, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of our Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. As we begin to close out the year, I decided to look back on our podcasts this year and find out which ones were the most interesting for those of you who are subscribed. Now, we've been podcasting here at Come Reason since 2006, quite a long time, but we have recently moved over to the YouTube format so that our podcasts are captured on video as well as audio. Of course, you can always still listen to us on Spotify, Apple Music, and many of the other ways that people get podcasts audibly. But YouTube, as our new channel is developing, has taken kind of a center role in how we start to communicate. Also, as we changed our format, our podcasts have become longer, more conversational. We've had many more interviews than in the past. While there are still certain times where we are offering teachings or extended lectures to you, the interview format or our roundtable discussions have also become part of our mix, really breaking up the whole series into some new and interesting tidbits. So, for this week and next week, during the holiday season, I've decided to review our different podcasts from 2023, and let's look at the top podcasts that have captured viewers' interest on Come Let Us Reason Together. Okay, folks, as I said, we're beginning to review the top 10 podcasts for 2023 at Come Reason, and we'll do 5 this week, 5 next week. The first one is one that I really enjoyed. This was our interview with Dr. Gary Habermas. Now, Dr. Habermas at Liberty University is an expert on the resurrection of Jesus. His work, his whole life's work, in fact, has focused on looking at all of the different scholars across New Testament studies, both past and present, and how they look at and understand the New Testament. One of the main arguments Dr. Habermas offers is the minimal facts argument, where he says, what are the things that most scholars who are focused on the New Testament agree upon? Even if those scholars aren't believers, they may be atheist, agnostic, any one of a number of belief systems, but there are still some primary concepts, primary facts that they hold true. So in our podcast, Resurrection, Near-Death Experiences, and the Shroud of Turin, interview with Gary Habermas, he tackles this idea in this clip. And then, so, Jesus died. Again, that makes sense because it was a death reserved for slaves, and reserved for the lowest of the low, the most wicked crimes that you can imagine. Jesus dies by crucifixion. The second point that you note is that the apostles had some kind of experience that at least they believed was the resurrected body of Jesus. And this, you say, is pretty overwhelming as well.
Yeah, I would say 3 things that are virtually unanimous among critical scholars are: number 1, Jesus died on the cross; number 2, the disciples thought they saw him in some sense. And even some of the major skeptics, the big names, will say they had some kind of visionary experience. They saw something with their eyes that they thought was that. The third one is that Jesus' major message was the kingdom of God and how to get there. Oh. So, I mean, Mark opens up, Jesus came forth preaching the kingdom and saying, repent, because the kingdom's at hand. So that and the crucifixion and the resurrection, the appearances, are the 3 that scholars are going to give you. Now, of course, you have to answer what caused them to believe they really saw Jesus and be changed to such an extent. And that's very, very difficult because, as I was saying, today, very few scholars will take a single naturalistic theory and stand on it.
Also, Gary makes a note further about even Jewish scholars. Believe it or not, there are a few Jewish New Testament scholars in academia today. And it was a fascinating comment that he says the Jewish scholar that he references actually thinks Jesus may have risen from the dead. Listen here.
Critics don't think much of him.
Right.
Bart Ehrman says about the Mythers, he says,
Yeah.
they're frustrated that the liberals don't take their views more seriously. He said, but they don't have a foothold in critical theory. And he says, in fact, they don't have a toehold.
Yeah.
So people aren't listening to them, but the Bart Ehrman takes 20 pages saying what's wrong with him. The point I'm making is I am only dealing with reputable scholars. I don't care how liberal or conservative they are. In fact, usually I would rather talk about and cite and read the agnostics, atheists, and members of other religions. I would much rather read them. And they're the ones, I mean, one Jewish scholar, Pinchas Lapid, who had, interestingly enough, has a PhD, he passed away, but had a PhD in New Testament. He said he was one of 4 Jews in the world with PhDs in New Testament. He said Jesus is raised from the dead.
Wow.
He said the data are sufficient to say Jesus is raised from the dead. And he says, so therefore I'm always asked, therefore, do you believe that he's the Messiah? Now, that's an interesting question because the question presumes that if the resurrection is true, something follows from it.
Right.
And therefore is he who he claimed to be. And Lapid basically takes a very popular Jewish view that's been around for over 100 years. And the view is that Jews still come to God through the law. Everybody else in the world, Jesus is sort of a Gentile Messiah.
Wow.
Really interesting. So if you say there's 40 million Jews in the world, 40-ish million, that means the rest of the human population has Jesus for their Messiah, according to this view. It's a pretty popular Jewish.
Finally, in our interview with Dr. Habermas, he discusses near-death experiences. Part of his research into the resurrection of Jesus is to understand and maybe counter the argument that Jesus didn't really die, but he was nearly dead. Of course, there are strong answers against such a claim, but that led Dr. Habermas into a side discussion, a side study of near-death experiences, and it's actually pretty fascinating. Here's a clip for you to see. So, one of the things that's kind of intriguing to me, though, is these kind of studies that you've done led you into a kind of a side investigation of near-death experiences and if they're even... Yep. And this was an initial response to objections to the resurrection account, right? Maybe Jesus, I don't know if it was Christoph Lake that you were looking at or something else, but tell me how you got into the NDE and what you've been finding there.
Lenny, I did not realize for probably a couple decades that the reason I settled on the resurrection, of course I wanted to know if Christianity was true or not. And I was quite skeptical. I used to debate Christians, by the way. I used to say all kinds of wicked things about them and tell them that they couldn't know the Bible was the inspired word of God, for example. And I went off on them. But I realized a couple decades later that because my doubt was framed by 2 bookend deaths in my life of the 2 closest people ever in my life, I realized that I studied resurrection because I was on a quest to know if there was an afterlife. I was on a quest to know if I would see them again. And I didn't realize that at the time. And as I said, there's a line, even in the New Testament, from the resurrection to the resurrection of the believer, almost 20 times, and it's the most common comparison for the resurrection. And so it would just be natural that as I'm doing NDEs, I'll give you an example. If I'm studying creation, and that's my life's work, creation, and all of a sudden somebody comes out with stuff that we now call intelligent design and fine tuning, of course I would want to look at it, and they would say, well, why do you want to look at that? If those fields tell you there's a God, you don't know which one it is. It's not worldview specific. And I'd say, yeah, that's true, but fine-tuning and intelligent design helped me to encapsulate creation in my own mind. Okay, that's very similar to resurrection. NDEs, I don't think they're miracles. I think they're supernatural somethings from another world, but I don't think they're miracles, and I don't think they tell you which religion is true. Very much like intelligent design and fine tuning and arguments for God's existence. Very similar to natural revelation, natural theology. So I started studying NDEs because, again, my underlying reason was: is there an afterlife?
Okay.
I want to know who was I going to see, and would that be true for me, and to settle my own quest for, life after death. So that's where the NDEs came in. But I realized that I was studying them. It's a strange backdoor to resurrection, because just like, to use my example, my analogy, just like intelligent design or fine tuning is a nice backdoor to letting you argue for creation of some sort, some theory, the truth of NDEs would make you look back and say, well, all you guys who don't believe in the resurrection, because you don't believe there's another world like this one, these NDEers, they apparently went to another world. They're screaming at the doctors who are pounding on their chests, and they're saying, leave me alone, I want to die. Having seen this, I don't want to come back. And they're screaming this, and all of a sudden they're back in their body, they were resuscitated, and they pushed the hands away, and the doctors say they were downright angry. I thought I was doing a good thing. They were somewhere where nobody could hear their voice, just another realm. And if there's another realm, I think that gives a real jump start to the resurrection. If we already know there's an afterlife, why are you objecting to a specific example called the resurrection of Jesus?
Okay. And
so to me, it comes together very nicely.
Number 9 on our list of top 10 podcasts was a talk that I was able to give aimed at junior high and high school students at a conference down in Southern California. The title of the message was The Beauty of Heaven and Hell. And this was really an interesting approach, how we can understand our eternal nature as human beings. How did God create us? Why is there heaven? And why would there be such a thing as hell? Here I explain how humans are, by their design, ones who will live eternally, that God cannot snuff us out or annihilate us, because that would be antithetical to the concept of us being human.
Have a sense of right or wrong, really. They just act on instinct. The black widow doesn't cry before she slaughters her mate. We do. We're created to continue to live with God, though, in this eternity. If God loves us, and love is the ultimate good, then stopping love would be something less than the ultimate good, wouldn't it? Have you ever thought about that? Heartbreak is when love ceases. Would God want love to cease if he's the embodiment of eternal love? He'd want love to go on forever. So when he creates us, guess what he does? He creates us as eternal beings. Adam and Eve were to love God and have that relationship with him for eternity. A fundamental aspect of who you are as a human is that you are an eternal being. Eternity in the sense of from a point in time starting forward. You aren't everlasting in the sense that you never had a beginning like God, but you do have a eternity with him in the future. Now, love always has the welfare of the beloved in mind. God is thinking of your best interest. That's what love is. That's how you define love. Love isn't this gushy feeling I have inside me. That's attraction, but that's not true love. True love is I'm willing to sacrifice for you, for your betterment. And true love is not, again, just making the other person feel better, because sometimes to really love a person, you've got to make them maybe be uncomfortable. If you've ever known anybody who's, say, had an addiction or possibly cheated on a test or something where you have to confront them, you do so not so that you can get them. Some people may. That's a motivation. But if you love that person, you do so for their betterment, so that they can improve, so that they can thrive. So God creates us to be eternal so that our love relationship will go on eternity. Therefore, an eternity with God would be heaven, would be the apex of our existence, exploring that love relationship. Imagine having the most beautiful, the most lovely person you've ever met, and you have an eternity to understand who they are, and they have an infinite set of attributes that you can never fully comprehend. You can spend your eternity learning more and more about them. It never grows old. It never becomes stale. That's heaven. That's beautiful. Again, that's what we aspire to. A love relationship that's so passionate, that never cools, that's so driven, that you're thrilled just to be in the presence of another person. And basically, that's how I define heaven. That specific area where God dwells. Now, the book of Revelation tells us, by the way, that heaven isn't some ethereal plane where God is going to be out there and we're going to be on clouds playing harps, or pick your favorite Warner Brothers cartoon, right? Actually, human beings were created body and soul. Adam and Eve, before they sinned, they were physical, three-dimensional beings living on a physical earth planet. And in the new heavens and the new earth, Revelation 20 and 21, so we again will be physical body and soul beings. Humans are incomplete unless they're both physical as well as spiritual. It's body and soul together that make a human, which is why you see the new heavens and the new earth created, and God comes down and lives in the new Jerusalem on earth with us. And we have that relationship. That's heaven. That's what we desire. Free of pain, free of suffering, no more death, no more destruction, all the good things. That's what a God of love seeks for us, which then offers the next question. Well, if that's what he offers, then why in the world would such a God create hell? And usually this is the biggest sticking point for people, so I do want to spend some time here. Now, certainly hell is pretty controversial today. You don't hear a whole lot of hellfire and brimstone preaching, right? Does it contradict this idea that I've painted about God? How do we understand hell? Well, what do we first of all mean when we talk about hell? What does that word mean? Because a lot of people have a lot of different conceptions. And again, a lot of our concepts of hell come from popular media or even classic media, Dante and Milton, rather than biblical understanding. Now, there are several words that were written in the original languages of your Bible that have been translated into hell. The first one is the Hebrew word Sheol, and this is really common. Sheol means the abode of the dead. It's referenced all throughout there. It may be translated hell. Sometimes it's translated the grave in the Psalms, things like that. It does, though, contain an idea that there's a place of torment for the wicked. If you look at Numbers 16:33, Job 24:19, and Psalm 9, verse 17, these all have specific concepts of hell as being a place for tormenting those who have been wicked or broached God's law. It's also, though, in the Old Testament, kind of an idea that there's a common place for all humanity to go. There will be a place to which we pass once we die physically. Psalm 16:10, Isaiah 38:10, and Psalm 33. So that's Hades. That's Sheol. I'm sorry. Hades, which is the Greek word, which comes in the New Testament mostly, is the translation of the idea of Sheol. So in other words, when the Old Testament scholars were starting to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, about 200 years before Jesus, what they found out was Hebrew was a lot like Latin. Most of the people were living in the world, they didn't speak Hebrew. It was kind of a dead language. It was used in the religious services, like Latin would be used in the Catholic Church, but nobody actually spoke it. So in order to read the Old Testament scriptures, they had to translate them into Greek, and they used Hades for the words for Sheol. Now, many times in the New Testament, Most famously, when you talk about that story of the rich man and Lazarus, Hades is the word that they're referring to. And it seems to have these two compartments, right? If you remember the story. The rich man, who was cruel and selfish, didn't care about Lazarus at all, begging at his door. He went to this place of eternal torment. Lazarus was taken up into Abraham's bosom, and they could somehow see each other in this realm. And he said, you know, if Lazarus could just dip the tip of his finger in water and put it on my tongue, it would be great. But that's the same concept that Hades, Sheol, and that's usually where you get the word hell from. There's also a couple of other words, Gehenna, which actually is the translation for a valley that sits outside Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom. And that valley was a trash dump. You can visit it today. It's not quite the same as it was. It used to always be burning. There was always, you know, when you pile a lot of trash together, you get a lot of methane gas building up as things rot and break down. And how do you get rid of it all so it doesn't overwhelm you? Well, they started fires. And there was always fires going on in Gehenna, in the Valley of Hinnom. That's on the south of Jerusalem. So Jesus uses it as a picture when he starts talking about eternal punishment. Matthew 5:22, Matthew 10:28, Mark 9:43-47, Luke 12:5, and James also, where there's, you know, weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? That kind of thing. And then there's the last reference, Abaddon and Tartarus. These you see in things like Revelation 9:11. Abaddon is somehow connected with Sheol, but that's where it means destruction. Abaddon is the term. It just means destruction. That's where the scorpion-like locusts come out of in Revelation chapter 9. They come out of Abaddon. Tartarus, 2 Peter 2:4. It's a Greek term that was used in Greek mythology, but Peter says in 2 Peter 2:4, quote, God did not spare the angels that sinned, but threw them into Tartarus and delivered them to be kept in chains of darkness until the judgment. So that seems to be a very special isolation that's kind of like the worst of the worst, so to speak. Anyway, the distinction between Hades and Gehenna, again, you have that Abraham's righteousness, but it seems that once the resurrection happens, maybe the righteous are no longer confined to the area of Hades or Sheol where Abraham's bosom sat. Jesus opens the door to the Holy of Holies, if you will, book of Hebrews, and the righteous are now allowed to have some presence with God because of the righteousness of Christ. But there still seems to be a place where the wicked must dwell until they are resurrected. Because you are human beings and you will be resurrected whether you're good or bad. The reason for that is God cannot do anything evil. He won't make you less than what you are. If you are created body and soul as a human and you are not resurrected, then you are, again, something less than human. He's left you in a state of impoverishment. And an all good God can't do that. He's also made you an eternal being. Okay, so why did God send people to hell? That's our first question. Well, hell wasn't simply designed for people.
Coming in at number 8 is an interesting talk that's kind of very central to the apologetic task. Talking with Jehovah's Witnesses. How do we understand and approach the witnesses? A lot of people have been interested in this as JWs come to their door, and how do they deal with it? Well, there's a lot of issues that you have to talk about when you're discussing historic Christianity versus the aberrant beliefs of the witnesses. But one primary aspect that really always provides a lot of trouble for the witnesses is the concept of the Trinity. Now, many Christians get tongue-tied when they deal with issues of the Trinity. But as I explore here, the Trinity is central to its understanding of what Christianity is all about. So here's a little clip of me discussing The difficulty of the Trinity with the Jehovah's Witnesses.
The Trinity. Trinity is a tough issue. Matter of fact, when you're talking to witnesses, this is probably the hardest thing for them to accept. I've talked to a lot of ex-witnesses who said they understand that there's been changes made to the Bible. They understand that maybe the watchtower and the invisible coming and all of that stuff isn't up to snuff. But they have a real hard time. The Trinity is one of the things that almost takes them the longest to accept. Because to them, they see the Trinity as like a god with, or one of those, mythical Greek beasts with 3 heads, right? Or if you're a Monty Python fan, the knight with the 3 heads that was in Monty Python. That was great in the Holy Grail. That's the clip I'm going to use next time I talk about this. Yes, the Knights Husseini. But that's not a proper understanding of the Trinity. Okay? The Trinity isn't that you have 3 different guys, 3 different beings in one, right? Because if you had a kind of a Siamese twin situation, those are actually 2 different people. They're 2 different beings. They are joined, but they're not, you can separate them and they could still have their individual autonomy. Okay, so it's not 3 gods. It's one God. It's one essence, one being with 3 personages in them, 3 persons. Now this, again, is like, how do you picture that? What do you do? And usually when you try to give examples, you fall into one or, you fall into one type of heresy or another. So it's not like, well, God is an egg, you have the shell and the yolk and the white. Or God is, that's dividing God into parts. It's partialism. God is not like an egg, because Jesus is fully God, the Father is fully God, the Spirit is fully God. A shell is not fully an egg. Okay? Or, well, God is like water, where it can be ice, or it can be steam, or it can be liquid. Well, that's called modalism, where God can shift his position or shift the way he presents himself to us. But there's one person who's just kind of wearing 3 different masks or 3 different, right? So these are the problems that you have with examples. Anytime you try to stumble in on an example, you stub your toe. Now, part of the problem is that you're talking about a being who transcends our 3-dimensional space. But let me try to give you something at least that you can hold on to, because I just don't want to all, well, we just don't know, and we throw up our, because usually when you talk with the witnesses, most of them will say, the Trinity makes no sense. Look, you guys can't even explain it, right? I've gotten that challenge. Explain the Trinity to me. You say, okay, what you have to understand is being is something different than personhood. Can we agree upon that? Well, what do you mean? Well, you don't have to be a person to be a being. Okay? A living being can be a tree. A tree is a living being. Fish is a living being. A dog is a living being. How much personhood does a tree have? 0. How much personhood does a dog have? 0. How much personhood does a human have? 1. 1 human is 1 person. So you can be a being without being a person, which means being and personhood are separate. God is a single being, but he has 3 personhoods. So dog is a being with no personhood. Human is a being with 1 personhood. God is a being with 3 personhoods. Or maybe 3 centers of consciousness. Maybe think of it that way. 3 centers of consciousness, where you have equal, and they share the divine will in all things. But Jesus does pray to the Father. Lord, if it is your will, let this cup pass from me, right? That prayer and that relationship, primarily, the biggest plus of the Trinity is the fact that it makes God non-dependent upon his creation. And you got to think about this. If God is, we all agree, and the Jehovah's Witnesses would agree, that God doesn't need anybody or anything. He's completely self-reliant, self-existent. We also know that God is love. Well, how can God be love before he creates humans? See, some people say, well, he created humans to love so that he could love somebody. He was lonely up there in heaven or something like that. Well, no, that's not God. God doesn't need us. He's not lonely. God can express his love in the fact that there was a relational aspect between the Father and the Son, and the Father and the Spirit, and the Son and the Spirit. Those three centers of consciousness related to one another in love prior to his creating at all. So the only way I see that God can be truly self-existent, that God can express himself in love before he creates, is if he is interpersonal within himself. Does that make sense? And if personhood is different from being, then it makes sense that you would have a God of love be interpersonal, needing nothing outside of himself. So, however, the Jehovah's Witnesses deny this. They come real close to the ancient 4th century heresy of Arianism. Arius believed that Jesus was a exalted being, kind of almost God, but not totally God, not fully God, not God the Father God. He was a created being who took on certain divine attributes. And this is really close. The Jehovah's Witnesses is almost classically Arian in their understanding. And the church really for 75 years debated this issue really, really hard. So it's not like we've never heard this before. And there's a lot of good writings on it. But realize that this is their stance on the nature of God. So they deny the Trinity, and they deny the idea that Jesus is a eternal being, that he was God, right? As Hebrews says, that he is the same to all eternity. They would hold that Jesus is a God, a mighty God. They would point to scriptures like Psalm 82 or even Isaiah 9:6. They will call him mighty God. See? And they will say, oh, it's not almighty God. It's just mighty God. It's like a lower rank. It's like a 3-star general instead of a 4-star general. That's the idea. But he's actually Michael the archangel. Ultimately, they take Daniel 12 and some other passages, and they try to imply that Jesus is actually Michael the archangel, the prince over the people of Israel, because Jesus claims kingship, and the royalty factor comes in. That's what they believe. Now, if you challenge them and say, please show me from your scriptures where it says Jesus is Michael the archangel, obviously it's not there. It's an imposition on the text. They don't have a text to do it. But here's what they say when we talk about the method of salvation. Obviously, all of this changes the method of salvation as well. In Watchtower, February 15th of 1983, there was this great article that talks about salvation and the Watchtower organization and what authority is, how you would be saved. And they give 4 requirements in this article. And they say, quote, the first requirement is basically believing the nature of Jesus as the Watchtower understands it. They say, quote, Jesus Christ identified a first requirement when he said a prayer to his Father. This means everlasting life. They're taking in knowledge of you, the only true God, and of the one you sent forth, Jesus Christ. John 17:3. Knowledge of God and of Jesus Christ includes knowledge of God's purposes regarding the earth. So, the idea that you'll live forever in paradise. And of Christ's role as earth's new king. Will you take in such knowledge by studying the Bible with us? So that's the first requirement for salvation, for living an eternal, and they don't use, it's not salvation as the word that they use. They use the idea that you can live forever in paradise, right? So that's the first piece, is that you have to understand knowledge of God's purposes regarding the earth, regarding Christ's kingship, and who Jesus is. The second requirement that they lay out is really what amounts to a denial of grace and works righteousness.
One of the things that people often wrestle with, especially atheists and agnostics, is the concept of God's hiddenness. Why does God seem to be so hard to find? Why is he not make himself known more broadly? Well, at number 7 in our top 10 list, Why Does God Remain Hidden was the podcast that we dealt with. And it's a fair question. When we look at aspects of our life, we have to say, if God wants himself to be known, why doesn't he just make himself bigger? Well, there's certain reasons why that's true. And here I kind of tease out the idea of what God's hiddenness means and maybe why hiddenness is actually a good thing.
That's why he also says, a person's heart plans his way, but the Lord determines his steps. So God is in charge. He may be hidden, but he does control these aspects of our lives that we may think are just going on their own momentum. The other thing that one has to remember is God has a track record. And one of the things that Scripture does continuously is reinforce the track record of God. First of all, God is the creator. And if you read the Psalms over and over again, that's the calling card he points to. I am the one who created the heavens and the earth. I set the world in order. Right? When Job was questioning God's control over his suffering, how did God respond to Job? Were you there when I put the Pleiades in order? Were you there when I set the stars in the sky and named each one of them? Were you there when I told the seas to go this far and no farther? He pulls the creation card. He says, look, if I can do that, if creation exists, then you know I'm here. He's also a God of the covenant promise. Israel knows that they were enslaved once in Egypt, and God delivered them from that. Heck, he just kept his promises by releasing the Jews from Babylon. That's in living memory of this book, right? So they should have known, hey, this is a real God. Look, he keeps his promises. Matter of fact, that passage in Isaiah 45, the main thrust of it is God calling Cyrus and telling Cyrus he's my chosen vessel in order to release the Jews from their captivity. And that was written 150 years before Cyrus was born. Pretty impressive. So the Jews should be able to tug on these promises. And they should be able to walk forward understanding that. Now, in Ezra and Nehemiah, we read that the Jews who trusted God went back to Jerusalem, understanding he is a God of the covenant who gave the land to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that 70 years of captivity, as Daniel said, were to be determined. But at the end of 70 years, we are to go back again and be restored. The Persian Jews didn't take that step of faith because they're still in Persia, right? They're still hanging around Babylon and other places like that. So God sets forth a different way for them to show their steps of faith through this test. What are you going to do when your lives are threatened by the most powerful being on the earth, King Ahasuerus? You better trust God. There's a really famous aphorism that goes along many Jewish people, especially when they face some kind of hardship, right? Lord, I know we've been the chosen people for 5,000 years, but can you choose somebody else for a while? You know, that's a common joke. And you understand that because the persecution that has happened to the Jewish people all the way through, obviously, the 20th century at least, the Russian pogroms, the Holocaust in World War II, you can see these kinds of things happening over and over. Yet, what about us? Are we exempt from this? Do we not suffer or question things or doubt because of God's hiddenness? I think God's hiddenness challenges modern believers. We worry about our salvation. I know a lot of folks who worry about their salvation because they just don't feel God. I don't feel God like I used to. When I was a new believer and I was engaged in church, I would do my morning devotions. I would set out and the birds would be chirping and it would be a beautiful morning and I could feel God's presence. And it's been several years now since I've actually had that feeling of God's presence. Maybe I'm not in God's good graces anymore. Maybe I'm not saved anymore. Is that a worry that you would have? Is that a worry that people that you know may have? I've heard it many times. But we are called to live by faith, not by what we feel or what we see, but what we do not. Thomas, right? As the picture shows, I can't believe until I see him with my eyes, until I put my fingers in the holes in his hands and stick my finger in his side. Then I'll believe. And what did Jesus say? Well, Thomas, he appears to them a week later, hey, come do it. I want you to believe. But blessed are they who don't see and still believe. And even though our bodies in our present world can ache, age, sickness, nobody knows anything about that in this church, or just the weariness of trying to make it in 21st century culture with not merely the moral and secular onslaughts against one's faith, but also just how do I live and afford life in this world? Even though we go through those things temporally, we shouldn't doubt. We need to believe. So 2 Corinthians 5, 4 through 7 says, Paul writes, indeed, we groan while we're in this tent, meaning his earthly body, burdened as we are because we do not want to be unclothed, but clothed. We don't want to be left to the world. We desire the riches of heaven. He says, we don't want to be unclothed, but clothed so that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who has prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave us the Spirit as a down payment. We've got a little bit of the promise. So we are always confident and know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. So it's the same message, isn't it? It's the same message. And God still has a track record.
All right, rounding out this first section of Top 5 was the podcast entitled, Do I Have to Try All Religions to Know Which One is True? Now, this was predicated on a objection I received over the internet from an atheist who gave me a challenge. He says, how many faiths did you have to try out first before you settled on Christianity? It's an interesting objection. Is there a way that we can talk about this? Did we just jump into Christianity, ignore everything else? Well, not really. Here I explain that when you start talking about faith, you can actually, from a logical standpoint, start to eliminate contradictory belief systems pretty quickly. And here's the challenge that was given to me, and here's how I answered it.
And the challenge came in from a gentleman by the name of South Humanist on Twitter, and he says, why did you end up deciding to believe in the particular deity that you did? Well, I went to the deity store and the other stuff they were all out of. So I just got this one. No, that's not what I said. I said, because Christianity is the only belief system I've found to be both internally and externally coherent. So he immediately shot back, well, how many others did you try before arriving at that conclusion? Fair enough question. And I said, I told him, you don't try on belief systems like a new pair of pants. How about you? How did you arrive at your beliefs? Now, his first response was, well, why not? You obviously evaluated Christianity and found it scratched your itch. Why did you just stop there? And then, of course, he responded to my second question. By the way, atheism isn't a knowledge claim. It's a null hypothesis. I'm talking about deities. I said, well, that's a common dodge. Atheists often say, I don't have anything to prove because I'm an atheist. It's a lack of belief. But it's untrue. If I tell a prospector there's no gold in a hill, I'm claiming knowledge about the hill. I am actually making a claim, the claim that gold is not there. We'll come back to this discussion a little while later. But he does bring up a point. How do we know that Christianity is true? How do we choose a religion? How did you go about it? Because we shouldn't just believe what we've been told if that doesn't conform to reality. What I said was Christianity is the thing that best, both internally and externally, coheres to reality. And when we start thinking through a belief, it really doesn't take a whole lot of time. Matter of fact, you don't have to be a religious expert in all faiths. You just have to know a little bit. So let's think through our belief a little bit. First of all, we can know that there is a God. Let's start there. If there's a God, why is there something rather than nothing? How do we get a thing if there's no thing to begin with? That thing is exquisitely designed. We see even in modern science a thing called what they call the anthropic principle. Basically, it seems like the universe is designed so that humanity can live and thrive. So creation points to God. How do we know good from evil? If there's no God, then morality is relative and everybody can do whatever they want. Reason and consciousness point to God. Where does reason come from? Even if you have a bunch of material, blobs of existence, the goo of the sea, of even amino acids, they don't start coming together and thinking. That's something different. And beauty even points to God, the objective nature of understanding something that is beautiful in and of itself. Now, I don't have time to develop all those. You can find those answers elsewhere, but we know that there is a God. But by the way, we also know that God is one. Now, this is a big one. Why do I say that? Because if God if there's a multiplicity of gods, that pulls a lot of religions into play. But if God is only a singular being, then you've eliminated Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, all the polytheistic faiths, all the animistic faiths, the Greek gods, the Roman gods. You've basically cleared a lot off the table, right? So we know that God is one for two reasons. A 17th century, where's my guy? There he is. A 17th century philosopher and legal scholar named Hugo Grotius wrote a book, actually, and he noted why God has to be a singular person, has to be a singular being, I should say. First, he says, a necessary being must be singular. You must be singular to be coherent. A necessary being, Grotius writes, he says, having proved the existence of the deity, we come next to his attributes. The first whereof is that there can be no more gods than one, which may be gathered from hence because, as was before said, God exists necessarily. Now, any of you who are familiar at all with Thomas Aquinas in his 5 ways would understand the self-existence and the necessary being idea. God is necessary, or he exists as self-existence. Now, that which is necessary or self-existent cannot be considered as any kind of species of beings, For if you imagine many gods, you will see that necessary existence belongs to none of them. Nor can there be any reason why 2 should rather be believed than 3 or 10 or 5. Besides, the abundance of particular things of the same kind proceeds from the fruitfulness of the cause, in proportion to which more or less is produced. But God has no cause. That's how we understand God. So if you get a bunch of them, if you think of the Greek gods, right? There's all these stories. Even Zeus has comes from the Titans, right? And he kills his father, and there's this whole thing. There's always this chain of events, but that doesn't make him a necessary being. That makes him a contingent being. He doesn't come into existence unless the Titans came into existence, and they don't come into existence unless there's a primordial portion before them, and so on and so on. God has to be the starting point. So a necessary being must be singular, and a perfect being must be singular. Grotius continues, the concept of perfection necessitates singularity. He writes, quote, further, particular different things are endued with peculiar properties, I should say, by which they are distinguished from each other. That makes sense. If you can distinguish a dog from a cat, there's certain aspects that make a dog and a cat a cat. And these properties do not belong to God, who is a necessary being. Neither do we find any signs of many gods, for this whole universe makes but one world, in which there is but one thing that far exceeds the rest in beauty, the sun, and in every man there is but one thing that governs, that is the mind. Moreover, if there could be 2 or more gods, free agents, acting according to their own wills, they might will contrary to each other. And so one being hindered by the other, front affecting his design, and now a possibility of being hindered is inconsistent with the notion of gods. You see what he's saying there? He says if you have 2 gods, take the Zoroastrian faith, the Mithraistic faith, where you have a good God and an evil God. Well, that's not an all-powerful God, is it? Because the good God can't control the evil God, and the evil God can't control the good God. And by the way, where do those 2 guys come from? What was their source? There's something that they're pinging upon as well. So you can't call them God. They're contingent. They're wrestling with each other. They're not all-powerful. The idea of God being perfect necessitates a single being. And lastly, God must be personal. He can't be a monad. He can't be this primordial energy force that simply flows throughout the universe and doesn't have any mind, like several of the Eastern faiths have in their concept. There are certain Buddhistic traditions that hold to that. Because in order to create, if there was a time that creation wasn't, and then there was a time that creation was, that means that somebody exerted a will. They decided to create. There was a push, right? There was a decision. There was a point in time where action was taken. That doesn't happen as a monad. The force of gravity doesn't decide when to pull you down and when not to pull you down. It just is. But in order to be a creator, God, you have to have somebody that's a mind working. So even here, we can see that of all the faiths of the world, we're really basically down to 3. Monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Well, okay, everyone. That's the first set from number 10 to number 6 of the top videos of 2023. They were the top 10 podcasts. Interesting, this group, a lot of them were of the lecture type approach. Only one was a interview. But the top 5, most of them were me discussing issues with other people, either interviews with guests or in a roundtable discussion. So I hope you come back next week to finish out and see which one actually was the most popular interview of 2023. Until then, may you have a very Merry Christmas and may God bless.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.